Jo Jaspers. Again, her title is Beaver-Powered Restoration Program Manager at an organization called Trout Unlimited. And if you're unfamiliar with this program, I'm sure she will let us know what it's all about. So take it away. Feel free to share your screen. We're ready.
Thanks, Molly. Let me get this pulled up here.
Absolutely. Take your time.
Well, good evening, and thanks for having me. As Molly said, I'm Kodi Jo, and I work for Trout Unlimited, which is a nonprofit organization with the mission to conserve, protect, restore North Americans' cold water fisheries and their watersheds. It's been an organization, it was founded in 1959 in Michigan, and now it's nationwide. We have projects all over the US as far as Alaska and all the way down to Florida. So I am physically based in Washington State, and I run their Beaver project here in Central Washington. So hence the very long title that I now have. So today I really just thought that I'd kind of share my story and how I ended up here running a beaver project, which is kind of random, and also talk about the project and what we're doing here in Washington and beavers in general. You're probably going to learn way more about beavers than you ever thought you wanted to know in the next 20 minutes. So bear with me. So just a little bit about me. I'm from Washington State. I grew up here, and I think the main reason that I was so connected and inspired to go into a STEM field was the fact that I was raised in a beautiful place like this, right on the east slope of the Cascades, and my family just spent our time in the outdoors, and that really guided me into the natural world and the sciences. And I took that and kind of ran with it and ended up going to Washington State University, where I majored in wildlife ecology, and worked for about 6 years as a wildlife biologist for a Native American tribe here in North Central Washington. And while I worked with the tribe, I did a little bit of everything, mostly working with non-game wildlife species such as eagles. But I was also a part of the team that worked on the reestablishment of wolves on the reservation, as well as relocation and reestablishment of pronghorn antelope on historical lands. And so I learned a lot and had the opportunity to experience a lot of different species in that job. One thing while working there that I really started to see and notice was a little bit of disconnect between what we were doing as biologists and what the public and the residents on the reservation understood or knew. And from there, I really got interested into community-based conservation and outreach and education. And that led me to pursuing my master's degree with a program ran by Miami University in Ohio, and a partnership for me was with Denver Zoo. And so I started that program in 2016 and moved to Denver in 2017 and finished that program in 2018, winter of 2018, and received a master's in biology. And it was really focused on that community-based conservation and connecting wildlife conservation and education to the general public. And so for my focus on this project, I worked on lead-based ammunition and the impacts of that to raptor species, and really connecting with the hunting community on that. And so it's something I still work on today, and I'm really focused on, and really enjoy that aspect of connecting people with the work that's being done on the landscape. And that then led to a job with the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, where I really got to bring those two interests of mine together. And I was running a Seattle Urban Carnivore Project, which was working with volunteers and putting remote cameras in city parks. And so again, bringing these two aspects of outreach and education and connecting people with the actual science happening on the ground. And then now, like I said before, work for Trout Unlimited, and I just started in this position in May. And it's, again, a really great project in the fact that I get to marry these two things together again. And there's this conservation landscape level effort, but there's also this ability to engage the local community in the work that's being done. And I'm really excited to share with you guys more about this project. And so I figure we'll just dig right in. So the North American beaver is actually the largest rodent in North America. They can get up to 65 pounds. The biggest beaver we have had in our project is 52 pounds. They are semi-aquatic. They do not move very well on land. I'm sure you guys have all seen beavers waddling along. My favorite thing, I've heard somebody call a beaver a milk dud of the forest. And I think that's an accurate description because they can't move very fast when they're on land. And they're a really important prey species for a lot of the carnivores that we have. So wolves and cougars will eat beavers. And so it's really important for them to have deep pools and access to that for escape cover from predators. And then they're also one of nature's most prolific hydroengineers. You may have heard him called the ecosystem engineer, and we're going to dig into that a little bit more here. But looking at beavers and history, some people ask why beavers, like why now? What's the importance? And you have to go back to the very beginning kind of and look at historically what has happened to the beaver populations in North America. And they were a key role in the fur trade. And you can see in this map, you know, all over the West, we had trading posts, and you can see that the commercial trading areas pretty much covered the entire North America. And so the felt hats made out of beaver were a huge thing. And historically, pre-European contact, they estimate that the beaver populations in North America ranged from 600 to 400 million. And by the 1900s, that had dropped to about 100,000. So if you think about that, when settlers came out here out west, started to settle, they basically found a landscape that was devoid of beaver, that historically would have had beaver, and a lot of these places now did not. And they estimate that the population has come back a little bit. It is roughly between 6 and 12 million, I believe, currently. And when we think about beavers, and we think about the habitats that we have out here, and I am talking specifically to the West, just because that's where our project is based. You know, 50% of our water courses in the US and Canada are headwater streams. And these are the really important part of streams that provide that vital beaver habitat. They can exist elsewhere, but these headwaters are really important. Beaver are essential to driving some of these watershed ecosystem dynamics when it comes to water. And we'll dig into that in the next slide. But because the fact that 50% of our water courses were beaver habitat or are beaver habitat, and they provide all of these really important dynamic ecosystem functions, the loss of beavers on the landscape has been profound, and it's probably one of the biggest things that we've seen impact some of our waterways. And so because of this, in the last couple years, beavers have kind of become you know, a big topic, because we're starting to understand what these landscapes looked like before, when we had beavers on here. And so we can then ask, you know, what are all of the benefits that we see beavers providing in these ecosystems? And one of the big ones is, and the most obvious ones probably, is the fact that they can store water. And so when you put a dam in a creek, it's pretty straightforward. It's going to dam up that water and cause those ponds to form, and that water therefore will be stored. And in dry places like Washington and Eastern Washington, storing water for later in the year when things are drier is really important. They also provide and create these complex stream habitats. So when you pond up water, there's more moisture for riparian habitat to establish and riparian plants and trees. And so it adds all of this diverse complexity and biodiversity that many other wildlife species rely on to survive. They recruit wood. So when we talk about the dynamics of a stream, wood recruitment is really important for our fish species in the stream. And so if you put a dam in a stream, it's going to help collect some of that wood. They also help connect, our floodplains to our streams. And so if you, from the historical use of our landscape, certain things have caused stream incision or other things to degrade our waterways, and beavers can actually come in and help reconnect these waterways to the floodplains, and we'll dig into that too. And then, as I mentioned, just enhancing that biodiversity through all of these myriad of ways. So how do they do all of this? And you start to look at the science of the water cycle, the science of how streams work together and are all connected. And if we look at a stream as an example, this is a somewhat incised stream. You can see those banks that drop down to where the actual water is in the waterway. And the dams are fully spreading that stream there. And as it blow out, which is natural for beaver dams to do, it allows that stream to start to meander, which is really important for our stream dynamics. And then it also starts to allow that channel to widen. And you can see the difference between those two channels now is it's not as much of a V-shaped, really steep. It starts to have that valley bottom on there that's going to start to develop. And as beavers do, because they are very persistent, they tend to come in and they will rebuild their dams, and they will make them wider and they'll make them more stable. And what this does, this starts to collect the sediment, and other material will start to build up behind that dam. And from there, you get more blowouts, and the sedimentation is really great material for riparian plants and trees to grow in. So you start to see this biodiversity slowly come back in. You also start to see, the stream bed start to slowly build itself back up. You can see that those cut banks and that incision isn't quite as bad. And that biodiversity and complexity starts to be seen in some of these later progressions of a stream with beavers present. Again, they rebuild their dam. This is where you start to see that floodplain reconnection. And so that stream has been able to build itself up after years of dam building and sediments being collected behind the dam. And that stream is now reconnected to part of that floodplain where more water storage can occur. And eventually, in the perfect world, this is what our stream networks look like. They're braided, there's several different channels, there's riparian habitat, there's wetland habitat, and the beavers played a huge role in bringing us to this stage. And so these models are really what a lot of the beaver projects, and there are multiple throughout the nation, are really focusing on trying to reestablish on our landscapes and bring back some of those channels that have been incised from farming or cattle grazing or different things that we have done on the landscape. And now we can bring beavers back in and help bring them back to some of these more diverse stages. So that brings me to the Wenatchee-Entiat Beaver Project, which is the project that that I manage. And this was started back in 2018. A couple years before that, there was a lot of working to get it off and running. It's a partnership between Trout Unlimited and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Central Washington. Excuse me. And the goals of our project are really threefold. One is to reestablish beavers in the Wenatchee Basin tributaries. The second is to construct beaver dam analogs, which I will explain in a little bit. And the third is to provide landowner assistance and community education and engagement. All of those coming together, the ultimate goal is to bring all of these together in order to promote habitat enhancement, flow augmentation and storage, and help decrease some of those climate related impacts that we're seeing on our landscape. So there are several things that they've shown with beavers as far as helping on the landscape when large wildfires come through, and that's water storage behind dams and groundwater storage that these dams can produce, and keeping those flows in the stream for longer periods of time in our dry seasons. And so our goals all really stem off of those three areas. And so we're going to dig into each of those. But first, just looking at why here, why in the Wenatchee River Basin. And our project does cover two counties in Central Washington, Chelan County and Douglas County. And Douglas is the county just on the other side of the Columbia River. But the Wenatchee River Basin is probably one of the most important, and why we chose to focus on it to begin with and continue to grow. It has a large portion that is public land, which makes it a lot easier to work on, but also when you're putting beavers on the landscape, makes it a little easier to try and avoid any conflicts that may arise. It has a really diverse landscape. It goes from the east slopes, of the Cascade high elevations all the way down to the Columbia River where you're into the sagebrush low elevation habitat. So it's really diverse. The other primary thing is that we here in the valley have endangered fish species. And so we have steelhead, bull trout, and spring chinook, and all of these species are vital to these habitats in these areas, but we're seeing declines because of climate change. And they say that the beaver and the salmon co-evolve together. And so trying to work on, as Trout Unlimited, right, our mission is to support these cold water fisheries. We're trying to use beavers to help support these important fisheries that we have here in the Wenatchee Basin. We also have water issues, as I alluded to. There's a lot of our streams that are drying up in the summertime that didn't historically do that. There are multiple landowners that I will visit with as I'm out in the field, and they will say, I've owned this land for hundreds of years, it's been in my family for years and years and years, and this is the first time we've ever seen it go dry. And that is a reoccurring theme that we are seeing in the Eastern Washington. And then we have an active conservation community here in the valley. It's a very outdoor centered area. And so people are very interested and very supportive of projects such as this, which is really important. So as we looking at the project, we really kind of had to start at the planning process and move from there, because if you're relocating beavers, you have to have a place to put them. And thankfully, we had the partner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and all of our beavers stay, rent out a little raceway at the Leavenworth Fish Hatchery. And so these in this picture is old raceways that they used to have fish in at the hatchery that are no longer used. They're a little leaky and not as useful anymore. So we were able to take that and with some help of volunteers, you can see that we caged it off and made it our acclimation area for when we are relocating beavers. And After that, we just work on procuring beavers and getting supplies and materials to complete our work. And so the process really starts at our site selection. And going back to Dr. Rifkin's point about biology is just about as much of math and computer science as it is biology, I think that this is a prime example of that. I think it was Utah State University, developed a model called the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, the BRAT. And what this model does is it takes into consideration several different variables to try and predict how many beaver dam capacity, how much capacity there is on the landscape for beaver dams, both currently and historically. And so they completed that model for Utah. And then last year we worked with some partners here in Washington to expand that model to the areas that we work in here in the Upper Columbia Basin. And so what this tool does is it allows us to look at a landscape or a stream, really dial into an area and see what the probability, the capacity of that stream to have beaver dams on it. And so if you look right there in the middle of the map, the colors are a little difficult to see, but Mill Creek is one of the streams that we have actually relocated beavers to. And you can see that a couple different stretches along this stream have that darker brown color, which means that existing beaver dam capacity is extremely high. And so that tells us that that would potentially be a good place to do some beaver powered restoration in that stream drainage. The things that go into this model include things like elevation and precipitation, also the fish species that we have in the area, vegetation. So all of these variables that are important to beavers go into this model, and it gives us this output. And so when we're looking to relocate beavers or do any other type of beaver restoration, this model is our starting point. This is what tells us, okay, we're going to go here, and we're going to look at this site, and then we're going to determine whether it's suitable or not. So when we go out there to the landscape, to these high dam capacity areas, we then do what we call a scorecard. And basically, this is something that we've laid out to determine whether it really is suitable for a beaver relocation. And so specifically, we're looking at the water flow, we're looking at the substrate, we're looking at the food that's present, whether it's woody, deciduous, or whether it's herbaceous. We're also looking at if there's ponding and pools deep enough to provide cover for them when we release them. And so this scorecard will give us a score, and if it's over a certain number, then it's a high suitable location, and that is one that we will put at the top of our list for relocation. And then we also advertise. So we're really working on landowner education as much as anything. And so we do community meetings, we do conservation newsletters, we have a Facebook, we'll go on the radio. We're really just trying to get our name out there. And the first and foremost, we'll go do a site visit and we'll do beaver mitigation, which we'll put in fencing around trees, or we'll paint them to help keep the beavers in the spot that they are, but help these landowners, protect what they have. And we're trying to promote coexistence just as much as anything. And these are really important and something that we do first and foremost, but sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes there are issues, issues with roads or other safety concerns, and we will relocate free of charge. We use a Hancock or a suitcase style trap, as you can see in the picture. They stay a little bit in our acclimation facility at the hatchery. They get processed, they get little tags so we can somewhat track them, and then they get re-released to their new homes in the upper basin, where hopefully they are not causing any more issues and coexistence problems. So these are some of the areas that we release. Both of these are actually photos on that Mill Creek that I showed you guys before. They're released in the box traps there that you see. I also, being a biologist when I started, was one of the few females in a room. And this year, our 2020 Beaver crew was all women. So I always like to give a shout out for that, because you're starting to see more and more of that in the STEM fields, and it's very exciting. This is just a video of our release earlier this year. We're starting to use technology a lot more, such as the GoPro under the water. And so it's fun to see these animals move in these waters. They're so agile, and they're not agile online, but it really is amazing to see them move in the water, seeing those feet and those big old tails. And then once we release the beavers, we do pretty extensive monitoring. And this is a struggle with the beavers, because there's nothing saying that they're going to stay where you put them. And so you really need to stay on top of the monitoring. And we'll put game cameras out, so remote motion activated cameras. And that's what those two top photos are beavers that have stayed in the location. We've been able to capture photos of them. And then we'll also look for signs of beavers. So that lower photo is beaver chew on a stick in one of the release sites. And what we're looking for is essentially them building up these dams, creating this water storage, creating these places that we can help alleviate some of these climate stressors that we're feeling. And so Minnow Creek was one of our success stories. This was before beavers were released in this area. It was kind of a more constrained stream area, and within a year's time, they had built up a fairly large pond in that area and had stored a lot of water. Excuse me. So overall, looking at the project in the last 3 years, we've handled about 29 beavers. We've relocated to 15 different areas. And as you can see on the map, it's pretty widespread throughout the county on where we're trapping and then relocating. And we have had 2 trapping mortalities, which it actually is pretty good for these projects. Otherwise, the other option is lethal removal. And so the fact that we can provide this non-lethal alternative to the valley is really important to us. So the second prong of the project is the beaver dam analogs. And what these are basically man-made dams in the stream. And so they're there to mimic what a beaver dam would do, in hopes that a beaver will come along and build onto it and make it better, because we can certainly not do it as well as the beavers do. The thing about them, they call them the low-cost restoration technique because they're really relatively cheap to do. They don't have a huge impact on the stream like a lot of the restoration. A lot of stream restoration, they're bringing in backhoes and excavators and doing all of this dirt movement, and that's not great for our streams. And so by doing something like this, it's very less intrusive, and it also helps with the success of our beaver translocation. And so if we can pond up some water and give them those ponds that they need for predator escape, that is just one more leg up for these beavers when we release them. So the project has installed over 50 BDAs in Chelan County to date. And as you can see, they're made out of these posts untreated. You pound them into the dirt a couple feet, and then you come in and you weave them, and you can really weave them with just about anything. In our projects, we tend to use deciduous type trees like alder and willow and dogwood, things that beavers like to eat. Then you use rocks and mud and other things to kind of pack it tight. And the plan and the hope is to either bring beavers back to this stream, or they will recolonize naturally. There have been beavers historically on this stream, but it goes dry now. And so the hope is that we can, these BDAs will help retain the water later into the season, and then also we can hopefully bring beavers back to this area. And then the third prong for our project is community engagement. And this is one of the parts that I'm really excited about. It hasn't been a big part of the Beaver project. And with my background in community-based conservation, I'm really excited to build off of that. We do have volunteers that help us, which we really rely on to help us with some of this work. But we just received a grant to help develop a logic model for our community engagement strategic plan. We're really looking at ways to bring people in to the science part of this, not just lending a hand, which is invaluable time, but for me, I want these people to be contributing to the science and helping us conduct the monitoring or the relocation or being a part of the whole process. So that's something we're really starting to build on and bring to a larger part in this project. And then I would be, remiss not to mention all of the partners that have helped support this project. It's a lot of work, and it's taken a lot to get it off the ground and going as much as it has. And so we are so thankful to have support from so many different partners in the Valley and work with so many different people. So that's all I have. I would be happy to take questions now, Molly.
Wonderful. Let me, one moment. Okay, there we go. All right, I do have several questions for you. First of all, thank you so much. I'm not sure if you're able to see it. I sent you a little note, pardon my interruption, but Kim and I both were excited to hear about beavers, and especially amused by your comment, the milk duds. So thank you. So first, I have a question from one of our educators. Is there a consideration of genetic diversity with beaver release locations?
That's a great question. We don't know a lot about the genetics of the beavers just because there hasn't been a lot of research done on them. There is new things now, eDNA, which is something that we can actually collect water samples and it will show the DNA in there. And that's something we're going to start doing next year. So yes, it's coming. We're still learning. But they are a very social animal. And so when we do relocate them, we do try to trap as much as the family unit as we can and try and relocate them as a unit too. I know that's a little bit different, but that is something we do try to do.
That's really interesting. And the family unit especially, that's really interesting. Also, we're really interested in the question of how stream restoration with beavers or a biological method might compare to, say, an engineer undertaking a stream restoration project with human means.
Sure, and I kind of alluded to that a little bit in the fact that like the BDAs is they've kind of turned the BDAs, the low cost restoration technique, because you can't engineer it. Like you can't engineer a beaver dam. It's I don't even, it's beyond. And it's just low cost, low, and so when you're doing a bigger project that brings in the engineers, a lot of times it's a lot more expensive. It's a lot more earth moving, which can be really impactful, both positively and negatively. But and you're using a lot bigger machinery, and so these techniques allow the landscape to kind of run its course naturally and do what it would naturally do instead of coming in and saying, no, you're going to do it this way.
Okay, so let me see if I'm seeing this properly. You mentioned that Trout Unlimited works in many areas, and I've seen some of the regions mentioned through your website. We were wondering if you could speak to aquaculture and its impact on water quality and native fish species, or for example, I guess more specifically, how your work may interact with specific hatcheries or things like salmon migration, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure, yeah. So fish hatcheries are a big part of our community here. We have fish hatcheries all up and down the Columbia River.
Yes.
And so it's a big part of our salmon populations here in Washington State. And we work directly with the Leavenworth Fish Hatchery in regards to the fact that we have our beaver project hosted out of that hatchery. But there have been concerns about fish passage past beaver dams, and it's still a little bit out for debate there on that research. And a lot of what people will say, I think I mentioned this before, is that beavers and salmon evolved together, and so the beaver taught the salmon how to jump. Take that as a grain of salt. I don't know, but you know, it is a consideration to everywhere that we work, especially. You know, we'll work above where some of our ESA species are present in the higher waters for that.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of follow-up questions actually regarding the family units. So a couple of different educators asked questions. I'm going to kind of group them. Are beavers monogamous? What are the family units like? And is there a carrying capacity?
Yeah, so beavers are monogamous. They will stay together. And a family unit, it will be the pair, and then that year's kits, which will be like 2 to 5-ish. And then the 1-year-olds will actually stay with the family unit, and they won't disperse until they're 1.5. And so the family unit could be quite large if you have, you know, a litter of 5. That could be a large family unit. Again, that depends on food sources and everything. But so they are a very social species, and that's why I said we really try to relocate them in that unit if we can, because it also helps them stay where we release them a little bit more successfully if they have more beavers with them. Is there a carrying capacity? Certainly, there's always going to be a carrying capacity in any area that you work and any species that you work. What is that carrying capacity? I don't know the answer to that. And I would say that we certainly aren't there because our population numbers aren't anywhere near what they used to be. Our habitat's different. It's a little degraded. So the carrying capacity will be probably a little reduced. But the beaver has so long been just a species that's kind of just there on the landscape that nobody's ever really questioned, that it's a lot of new information that people are trying to learn and understand about this species.
That's really an interesting point there, particularly regarding the impact of the habitat. Pops and I have one final question, and this comes from Ken and myself. How does Trout Unlimited address issues around human-made dams? In other words, I suppose, is there any work that you do specifically regarding these dams? Does your organization interact with those other organizations or governmental organizations, etc.?
Sure, yeah, and there's been, you know, movements here in Washington specifically where we've gotten dams removed on some of the streams. The Enlow Dam, I think that's right.
Sounds familiar.
And so one of the other projects that we really focus on here in Central Washington is looking at water diversion. So whether that's for irrigation or for like water use, trying to get those off of surface diversions, and so maybe not the big dams that we're used to, but it's still a structure in the stream that's diverting water, and trying to get that more well-based so that water can remain in the stream and provide that habitat for our fisheries. And so that is a big part of what we do here in Central Washington. And I know that elsewhere, there are people working on the bigger dam issues on other rivers.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Kodi Jo, for joining us this evening. I think I mentioned this earlier, but Kodi Jo was in my graduate school together, and we spent some wonderful time overseas, but also obviously a very, very knowledgeable naturalist, biologist, and conservationist. And I'm so proud and so pleased that she could join us this evening. So thank you again on
Yeah,
personal and professional level.